Train was nearly ready to depart. The morning platform was quiet, contemplative, like an old soul lost in thought. Every so often, the silence was broken by an overhead announcement urging passengers to line up, or the soft thud of suitcase wheels rolling across worn tile. Mrs. Alma Hastings, 72 years old, stood in the line for business class boarding. In her hand, she clutched a printed paper ticket, its edges slightly creased, as if it had been carefully kept in her coat pocket through a long journey. She didn't travel far by train much anymore. This trip was an exception. She wanted to personally escort her husband's ashes home to Vermont, the quiet town where they had begun their married life over 50 years ago. She called it the last train for him, and in many ways, for her own memory too. When it was her turn, she stepped forward, offering the ticket with a gentle, respectful smile, the kind of gesture that spoke of old-fashioned manners. The ticket agent, a young woman in a crisp uniform, took it, glanced down, then looked up at Mrs. Hastings. Her expression slowly shifted, cooling as if something wasn't quite right. "Ma'am, this ticket is for business class." "Yes, dear, that's the one I bought," Alma replied, her voice soft as early morning air. "Are you sure? Business class isn't usually selected by." The young woman hesitated, her eyes drifting briefly to Alma's worn coat, its shoulders slightly frayed, before darting back to the ticket, as if searching for a technical reason to justify her doubt. "I'm sorry, but you'll need to wait in the general boarding area at the back. This ticket might have been printed incorrectly," she said, then moved past Alma to assist the next person in line. A long silence followed. Alma stood still, ticket in hand, not saying a word for a while. On her back was a small backpack holding a simple wooden urn, Harold's ashes. That morning, she had whispered to him, "Let's go home now." And yet now, on this unfamiliar platform, she felt like an intruder, unwelcome. She turned away, her eyes calm but heavy with sadness. It wasn't the young woman's fault, really. Alma understood the way the world often saw people like her. The elderly, the not wealthy, the ones who didn't look like business class. But what she couldn't accept was being turned away when all she wanted was to share this final stretch of the journey with Harold. Mrs. Alma didn't move. The crowd flowed past her, hurried and preoccupied, like city life that never pauses. But she stood still, like an old tree that hadn't yet left the forest, holding on for something unfinished before it could let go. The ticket agent, noticing she hadn't left, turned back with a slight furrow in her brow. "Ma'am, I already told you. Please move to the back. This area is for business class passengers only." Mrs. Alma looked up, her eyes clear, not weak, but steady. Her voice was calm, as if explaining something important to a grandchild. "Sweetheart, this ticket, I bought it 2 weeks ago. You're welcome to scan the code again if you need to. I chose business class because I need the quiet, and because the person I'm traveling with, he was a very decent man. The kind of man who would have belonged in a seat like that." The agent blinked, clearly thrown off for a moment. A younger colleague stepped over, glanced at the ticket, and whispered something quietly. Still, she shook her head. "I understand, ma'am, but rules are rules. If the ticket's valid, we can always reprint it. But right now, you're holding up the line." A few people began to turn and look. Some frowned. Others glanced at Mrs. Alma with a flicker of sympathy, but no one stepped forward. Mrs. Alma smiled softly. "I don't want to cause any trouble, dear. I just want to understand. Is there something about me that makes you think I couldn't be a business class passenger? Is it the old coat? The gray hair? Or is it simply because I'm old?" Her voice wasn't loud, but somehow it echoed through the platform, as if the whole space had paused for a moment to listen. "The person I'm carrying with me," she said, gently resting a hand on the backpack behind her, "is my husband. He served in the military, then spent his life teaching. I promised him that for this final trip, I'd bring him home with the dignity he deserves. This seat, it's for both of us, and I don't intend to leave, just because someone thinks I don't belong here." The young agent froze for a second. Most complaints came with frustration or raised voices. But Mrs. Alma's words, they were calm. They were true. The agent turned slightly, whispering something again to her colleague. Nearby, a couple nodded subtly toward Mrs. Alma. The man, in a business suit, spoke gently. "We don't mind waiting a little longer. Seems like she just needs her ticket confirmed." The agent stayed quiet, still staring at the piece of paper in her hand. But somehow the heart of the station had tilted in Alma's direction, toward a woman who didn't shout, but spoke the kind of truth everyone recognized. That respect doesn't come from the price of a ticket. It comes from how we choose to see one another in life's quiet, ordinary moments. The train hadn't arrived yet. Passengers still stood waiting under the gentle light of early morning. But no one chatted idly like before. The air had shifted, silent and strange. It was as if everyone was waiting for something else now, a response, or maybe a sense of justice to come echoing down from the loudspeakers above. Mrs. Alma stood there still, calm but unmoving. In her hands, she held a neat wooden box containing the ashes of her husband, Mr. Luis. They had shared 47 years together, weathering war, hard winters, and the rare blessings of easier days. He used to say, if there was one thing that made him unafraid of dying, it was knowing she would be the one to bring him home. The young agent still stood nearby, a notebook and ink-smudged form held close to her chest. Her voice had softened, but it still carried the chill of a license plate reader. Ma'am, I understand, but we have to follow the policy. Business class is for passengers with valid tickets, and cremated remains don't count as standard carry-on. Mrs. Alma pressed her lips together. I have a business class ticket. Louis has one too. We purchased them together. I also have copies of the death certificate and the cremation transit permit. Everything is in order, ma'am. I'm very sorry, but according to the handbook, section 4.3 under air travel safety procedures, Mrs. Alma cut in, her tone sharper now, for the first time. What safety is compromised when the deceased can no longer pose a threat to anyone? The young agent didn't respond. Perhaps she, too, could feel herself trapped, caught between protocol and compassion. But they're trained not to cry, not to waver, and certainly not to act outside the handbook. And so they stood there, the two of them, one clinging to memory, the other clinging to procedure. Mrs. Alma never lost her composure, but there was a heaviness in her eyes, a fatigue, and a kind of pain most people turn away from rather than face. In the middle of a crowd that had chosen silence, a middle-aged man stepped out of the line. He wore a rough cotton shirt and carried an old leather bag. Looked like someone who used to fix machines, or maybe a retired technician. Not the kind to make a fuss, but definitely not the kind to turn away when something felt wrong. Excuse me, he said, his voice warm and steady, like someone who might have once sung in a church choir. My name's Henry Clark. May I ask what exactly is going on here? The young agent fumbled for words. It's nothing really. Just a ticket issue. A ticket issue. I've been standing right behind, heard the whole thing. This isn't about a ticket. The lady has her tickets. The issue is that she's carrying the ashes of a loved one, right? Yes, and we're not letting her board business class, even though she has tickets for both herself and her husband's remains? Well, sir, it's because according to procedure. Mr. Henry raised his hand, gentle but firm. I don't blame you, he said. I know you've been trained to read from a manual instead of looking at people. But standing in front of you is a woman who spent over half a century with her husband. Now, all she wants is to take him home one last time, just as she promised. Do you see anything dangerous in that? The young agent said nothing. The crowd around them began to stir. A young woman further back added, I agree with him. This isn't about policy. It's about compassion. A man in an economy class suit nodded. If this were my mother, I wouldn't stay quiet either. And then, like a ripple spreading from the center, people began to murmur, to whisper, to stand together. Not shouting, not arguing, just quietly, firmly, no longer indifferent. The silence had changed. It was no longer passive, it had become a form of protest, gentle but resolute. Mr. Henry turned to Alma and said softly, You're not alone, ma'am, not today. There's something remarkable about how a seemingly small moment can spark the attention of so many. Alma's story, a wife simply trying to bring her husband home, might have passed quietly, like so many ordinary stories do. But not this time. When Mr. Henry stepped forward and spoke, the atmosphere on the platform began to shift. People who had once looked away started lingering longer. A few pulled out their phones, not to scroll like usual, but to capture something they felt mattered. A young passenger, a brown-haired girl with a crossbody backpack, whispered, "This needs to be shared." She opened a live stream app and typed a simple caption, This elderly woman is being denied boarding because she's carrying her husband's ashes, even though she has a valid ticket. What do you think? Within minutes, hundreds of viewers tuned in. Comments rolled down the screen, questions, outrage, and heartfelt reactions. Several larger social media accounts began reposting the video. One even added a headline, "When the rules forget the human heart." In another corner, a senior journalism student sat waiting for his train home to visit his mom. He'd witnessed the scene from the beginning, unsure how to react. But when others began to speak up, he opened his laptop and started writing a short piece for his campus news site. The first line he typed was, "Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just stands quietly, holding a small wooden box." Within 10 minutes, the footage spread fast. One clear clip captured Mr. Henry's voice saying, "You were trained to read the manual instead of seeing the person." That moment was shared thousands of times with hashtags like "Let her board," "Bring him home," and "#humanity first." At the train station, security began to take notice. A man in a blue suit approached the ticketing agent and whispered something in her ear. The young woman, the one who had first denied Alma, now looked visibly unsettled. Her grip tightened around the ticket scanner, and her eyes flicked toward Alma with unease. She hadn't expected that a seemingly harmless protocol could spark such a powerful reaction. There was something in the old woman's gaze, not anger, but a calm, unshakable resolve that made it impossible to carry on as before. A small child tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked, "Mom, why does that lady look so sad?" The mother knelt down and gently replied, "Because someone won't let her take him home." The child looked over at Alma. Then quietly, he walked up and placed a still warm cookie into her hand. Alma looked at him, smiled softly, her eyes misting. Meanwhile, on social media, posts began surfacing. "If this were my mother, I'd stand up too." We need to remember that service doesn't just mean protocol, it means people. A civilized society should never deny a dignified goodbye. Some Twitter users tagged the train company, demanding an official response. Pressure was mounting. Local news stations began picking up the story, and a reporter was already en route to the station. But amid the digital wave, Alma remained where she was. She didn't ask for help. She didn't cry or plead. She simply stood there, holding a wooden box, just as she had stood for years waiting for Louis to come home from work when he was alive. Waiting, with quiet faith, that love, however delayed, would be returned. She may not have known what a hashtag was or how a live stream worked, but she knew what was right. And that day, many others started to remember it too. Within 2 hours, the image of Mrs. Alma standing by the ticket gate had made its way across every major platform. Twitter was in an uproar. Facebook feeds filled with rapid shares. The photos were slightly blurry, but they captured the quiet presence of a silver-haired woman, hair neatly pinned up, arms holding a small wooden box, and eyes that held no anger, no blame, only a steady, enduring sorrow. No one knew her name at first, but people began calling her by affectionate names: the Southern Wife, the Lady Who Wouldn't Back Down, or simply Mama. A freelance journalist wrote, "I don't know who she is, but I know a woman like that deserves to bring her husband home." The post was shared over 74,000 times overnight. Short, emotional tweets became banners for a growing wave of protest against cold, unfeeling bureaucracy. She had a ticket. He served this country, and they still wouldn't let her board. This isn't just about a train, it's about how we treat someone else's grief. Public figures began to speak up. An actor known for playing a combat medic in a hit drama reposted the story with the caption, "If this were my mom, I'd break down every barrier to get her on that train." A well-known author wrote, "Sometimes you don't need all the facts. Just look at those old hands holding that wooden box. That's all you need to know." Veterans groups joined in, demanding an official apology from the train company, and asking the pointed question, if the soldier inside that wooden box once protected this nation, why was his wife barred from bringing him home? Somewhere in a small living room on the edge of town, Alma was still unaware of the storm unfolding. She didn't use Twitter. She had Facebook, but only to see photos of her grandchildren. Her old phone buzzed non-stop. She finally opened it to find a message from her granddaughter. "Grandma, you're famous now, but it's okay. Everyone's standing with you." She furrowed her brow and shook her head with a sigh. Lord have mercy. Who'd ever want to be famous over something like this? If Luis were still alive, he would have chuckled and said, "See that, Alma? You stir up a storm everywhere you go." Then handed her a cup of hot cocoa with that familiar grin. Alma smiled to herself. Tired as she was, she knew he'd be proud. Back at the train station, tension was rising among the staff. The higher-ups at the rail company had been alerted. A spokesperson appeared on a local news channel saying, "We are currently reviewing our handling of the situation. This respected passenger should not have been treated this way." But the internet wasn't so easily appeased. One comment read, "No need to review anything. Just let her on the train, now." The posts kept coming, videos, updates, messages, every single minute. Someone even created a TikTok account just to track Mrs. Alma's story, calling it @BringHerHome. The very first video, set to a soft piano melody, simply showed her standing quietly, holding the wooden box. Words faded in across the screen. Love doesn't die, it just waits to be brought home. A deep collective empathy spread, not just for the injustice, but because so many saw someone they loved in her. A mother, a wife, a keeper of memories for two. Another user wrote, "We live in a time when the good can go viral just as fast as the bad, and today the good is winning." And so, in a world rushing forward at full speed, the quiet story of an old woman and her husband's ashes made millions of hearts pause. Because sometimes kindness doesn't need a speech. It just needs one person to stand up or stand still to remind the world that before anything else, we are human. The next morning, just as the soft southern sunlight began to warm the edge of the station platform, a silver-gray sedan pulled up quietly in front of the passenger entrance. The car door opened, and out stepped a man in a well-tailored suit, blue tie, and a serious expression. He was the Vice President of Communications for the railway company, a title that sounded long and important, the kind that promised many words but not necessarily many solutions. Mrs. Alma was still seated in the waiting area, next to her suitcase and the wooden box now covered with a delicate lace cloth, one she had crocheted herself many years ago. A few people recognized the man who had entered. Some passengers began whispering, some pulled out their phones to livestream, and others simply stood, watching with anticipation. Mrs. Alma didn't rise. She only lifted her head, looking directly at him, her gaze absent of resentment, only the deep fatigue of someone who's waited too long for far too much. "Mrs. Alma Turner?" the man asked, lowering his voice in what he must have thought was respectful tone. "That's me," she replied steadily. No bitterness in her voice, no relief either, just a calm, grounded presence, unmoved by sudden attention. "We want to offer our deepest apologies for what happened yesterday. The incident was entirely due to a system error. There was a misstep in the verification process for business class tickets involving passengers with special luggage." A wave of murmurs rippled through the nearby crowd. "A system error?" A young woman repeated loudly into her TikTok livestream. "What kind of system decides who gets on the train and who doesn't, when the ticket is clear as day?" The spokesperson faltered just slightly but recovered, smoothing out his expression. He opened a small iPad and continued reading. "We understand this incident has caused significant distress, and it has also impacted the public perception of our company. As such, we've decided to issue a full refund for your journey, and we would like to invite you to use our premium lounge while you wait for the next available train. We also hope you'll consider participating in a passenger feedback program to help us improve services for elderly travelers." Mrs. Alma listened in silence, nodding slightly, like someone politely receiving advice on how to cook mung beans from a stranger she never asked. When he finally stopped speaking, she responded slowly, thoughtfully. "You say it was a system error," Mrs. Alma said calmly. "I don't know much about computers or complicated procedures, but I do know that yesterday I handed over my ticket at the right time, in the right place, to the right person. I know I was dressed properly. I spoke politely. I know I did nothing wrong. And I know for certain that the employee didn't have any issues with the system. She simply looked at me, looked at the box in my hands, and then said no." Silence settled across the room. No one live-streamed. No one spoke. Even the company representative lowered his head slightly, as if struck by a truth he couldn't deny. This wasn't a system failure. It was a human one, a moment when someone forgot what compassion looks like. My Louis used to work on the railroad. Alma continued, her voice slightly trembling, but her eyes still bright. He once told me, a good train ride brings you home, on time, with dignity. I don't know if what happened yesterday was a flaw in the system or a flaw in the heart, but I do know this. Luis wouldn't want me to board a train if it meant leaving my dignity behind. The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was steady, honest. A few eyes were visibly red. The representative stood still for a moment, then bowed his head deeply. "You're absolutely right," he said softly. "I'll take this message back to our entire leadership team. And on behalf of the company, may I have the honor of escorting you to the train, exactly as we should have yesterday." A few people reached out to help Alma to her feet. She smiled gratefully, adjusted the cloth over the wooden box, and walked forward slowly. No anger, no outrage. Just a calm born of the quiet belief that justice, even if delayed, is still worth waiting for. The young woman live streaming kept filming, and this time, the video captured Alma boarding the train, this time through the business class gate, was viewed more than 12 million times in just 5 hours. The caption reads simply, "No woman should have to fight this hard to be allowed one final act of love." The business class cabin was quiet and clean, with light blue curtains and seats covered in soft leather. As Mrs. Alma stepped in, a few passengers recognized her, not for her simple brown coat or the neatly pinned gray hair, but because they had seen the live stream that had spread everywhere overnight. Some eyes met hers. A few nodded gently, others offered a soft, supportive smile. But Alma wasn't looking for attention. She simply placed her small suitcase in the overhead compartment, then lightly brushed away the invisible dust from the lid of the wooden box she held in her arms. She sat down, adjusted the lace cloth that covered the box, and looked out the window. The train hadn't moved yet. The air inside the cabin seemed suspended, caught between thoughts left unspoken. The senior representative was still standing by the door, quietly watching her, as if waiting for something. He hadn't left yet, even though his job had clearly ended minutes ago. But it was Alma's quiet dignity that made him feel like nothing had truly been finished. "Mrs. Alma," he said softly. She turned toward him, her gaze calm, not cold, not warm either, just like a grandmother waiting for her grandchild to explain why the family's porcelain vase was broken. "Yes? I know, an apology isn't enough, but I sincerely hope you understand that the company values what you've said and done. We're holding an emergency meeting to review our entire protocol. Is there anything else you'd like to share?" Alma nodded slowly, then looked him straight in the eye. She didn't raise her voice, and her words weren't sharp. Her voice rang out like a small bell, just loud enough to reach the heart of whoever was listening. "You know, I spent most of my life with Luis, the man inside this wooden box. Luis worked on the railroad. He loved that job, not because of the pay or the position, but because he believed this: you can take people very far as long as you carry kindness with you. Every train ride is a journey, not just of the body, but of dignity." The man said nothing. Alma continued, her gaze steady, voice no longer trembling. "Yesterday, I showed my ticket properly, dressed neatly, behaved respectfully. I didn't ask for special treatment, only to be treated like a human being with a little dignity. But I was turned away. Not because the ticket was wrong, but because they looked at me and decided I didn't fit the ticket. They didn't see a widow taking her late husband home. They saw someone who didn't look the part of first class." Then she spoke slowly, clearly, so the man and the entire cabin could hear every word. "I don't need a first-class seat. I need respect for myself and for the man I'm bringing home." In that moment, no one said a word, not because they were silenced, but because no words were necessary. The man tightened his grip on the iPad in his hand, then bowed his head deeply. "You're absolutely right, and I won't forget it." He turned and left the cabin, his steps lighter than when he had entered. As the door closed behind him, the hum of the train engine rose again, like a heartbeat echoing through steel. Alma turned to the wooden box, brushed it gently, and smiled. "Let's go, Louis." The woman sitting across from her leaned in and whispered, "Your husband?" "Yes," Alma replied, "not sad, not regretful. He always dreamed of going back home one day. I promised I'd take him there, in peace, even if I had to fight a little." The woman nodded softly. Then, as if something had been unlocked, the two began to talk. No rush, No small talk, just like old friends reunited. Memories of loved ones, old stories shared, and quiet laughter floated through the usually hushed air of the first-class cabin. Outside the window, green fields slid by like the turning pages of an open book. The train was moving, and on it sat an unassuming woman who never asked to be honored, but reminded the world of something simple and true. Not everyone who sits in first class is noble, and not every noble soul gets offered a seat there. But respect should be for everyone. The train pulled into the final station just before noon. The country sunlight filtered through the old trees lining the tracks, casting warm golden streaks across Alma's silver hair. She rose slowly, cradling the wooden box in her arms as if holding a piece of her own heart. The station was small, with only a weathered sign bearing the name Dawson Creek, the town where she and Louis had grown up, fallen in love, and then said goodbye during the war. She had left nearly 40 years ago to follow him across the country. Now she returned alone, but not truly alone. On the platform, a small crowd waited. They weren't family, she had no blood relatives left here. But there were faces young and old, some holding flowers, others waving small national flags. They had come after reading the news, watching the video, and hearing the story of a woman who had bravely brought her husband, a veteran, back home. A little girl, maybe 10 years old, ran forward and handed Alma a hand-drawn picture. In it was an old woman with white hair holding a box, standing in front of a train. Small hearts floated up into the sky behind her. "I drew you," the girl said softly. "You're really brave." Alma knelt, her eyes misting for a moment. "Thank you, sweetheart. You're very brave, too, for sharing such a beautiful drawing." A middle-aged man stepped forward to shake her hand. He introduced himself as the head of the town's Veterans Association, his voice deep and full of emotion. "You didn't just bring Louis home. You reminded many of us what dignity looks like. We're holding a formal memorial. Louis deserves that, and so do you." What was meant to be a quiet arrival became a small but meaningful ceremony. A group of local students played a short piece of music Louis had once loved. The flag that had draped his military casket was carefully folded and presented to Alma as a gesture of honor. Meanwhile, on social media, Alma's story was no longer just an isolated incident. On Twitter, the hashtag #RespectTheFallen climbed to the top of the trending list. Thousands of users began sharing memories of their parents and grandparents who had served in the military and how they too were overlooked or dismissed when returning home. On Facebook, veteran groups began to speak out. Some shared how they had once been denied access to business class lounges for wearing their uniforms, or treated with disrespect while purchasing discounted tickets for veterans. A post from the official account of Veterans for Dignity read, "Not everyone sits in first class, but every veteran deserves respect." Alma's story reminds us that fairness isn't about train tickets, it's about how we choose to see one another. The railway company, which had initially intended to handle the situation as a minor PR issue, was now facing a growing wave of backlash. Over 200,000 signatures demanding a public apology were submitted to the company's official page within 48 hours. Celebrities, journalists, and politicians began calling on the passenger transportation industry to review how it treats the elderly, people of color, and veterans. An editorial in the New York Tribune wrote, "Alma never asked to sit in first class. She only asked to be seen as a human being. Yet in that quiet journey, she exposed a blind spot we still refuse to confront. That kindness is too often outranked by appearance, and service has forgotten sacrifice." That evening, in the little house at the edge of Dawson Creek, Alma sat on the porch sipping a cup of peppermint tea. Moonlight spilled across the wooden table, gentle as the hand of a husband long gone. On the table sat the wooden box, now placed with honor inside a glass cabinet, and a handwritten letter Alma had penned to Louis. She read softly, "Dear Louis, I've brought you home. They welcomed you with music, with flowers, with tears. But the most precious thing was how many people truly saw you, not as a box of ashes, but as a piece of the very best of who we are. Thank you for teaching me when to be silent and when to speak. Your dream is fulfilled. Now rest, my love." The night wind passed through the porch, and in that breeze, it was as if a warm, deep chuckle echoed from far away. 1 week after Alma returned to Dawson Creek, the railway company finally spoke up. Not through a cold press release drafted by the PR department, but in a short video where the CEO, eyes tired but sincere, stood in front of the camera and said, "We were wrong." He didn't make excuses. He didn't blame protocols or technical systems. Instead, he spoke about Alma, about Lewis, and about how one small action, denying a seat, could expose a deep flaw in a company's culture. In the end, the company pledged to overhaul its entire staff training process, implement a new evaluation system based on human-centered values, and most importantly, establish an independent council to oversee incidents of discrimination, particularly involving the elderly, people of color, and veterans. People often think media crises begin with major events, but in truth, they begin with a moment that lacks empathy, a decision that follows procedure but forgets humanity, and a workforce that lacks the courage to know when to be flexible, when to set aside logic and listen to the heart. In Alma's case, the employees weren't necessarily bad people. They were simply following protocol. And that's the most troubling part. A good system is built to serve people, not to turn people into servants of the system. A wrongful act doesn't just hurt an individual, it can shake the trust of an entire community. In the digital age, where every phone can become a media lens, respect and kindness are the strongest firewalls against crisis. As for Alma, she didn't file a lawsuit. She didn't ask for compensation. When asked what she wanted, she simply said, "I don't need a first-class ticket. I need respect for me and for the man who spent his life defending those very values." She reached the end of that fateful train ride, but her story continues, living on in the hearts of millions. A quiet, powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest change begins with seeing a person as if they truly matter.
Thank you, my dear friend, near or far, for staying with me until the very end of this story. I know that time is the most precious thing we have, and you chose to spend it with an old storyteller like me. That truly is a generous gift. The story of Miss Alma isn't just a headline or an incident at a train station. It's a call to compassion, to kindness, to justice, and to the quiet responsibility each of us carries. Sometimes that looks like a gentle glance, a simple question like, "Why won't they let her on the train?" Or a timely word shared with someone else. If your heart tightened just a little, or you felt something stir while listening to Alma's journey, then I believe you understand. You understand that respect doesn't come with a first-class ticket. And sometimes, all it takes is one person standing up for the whole world to follow. Please keep sharing this story, not for Miss Alma's sake, but for those still standing quietly on the platform of life, waiting for someone to speak up, waiting for justice to come around. Speak up. Keep your heart tender and your eyes open, because kindness always needs a place to rest. Wishing you a gentle day, Miss Ellie.